On March 24, 2026, Iran launched multiple waves of missiles at Israel, and the attack did not remain distant or abstract for long. Impact sites were reported in Tel Aviv and across central Israel, which immediately gave the event a different meaning from a routine exchange of fire. The sequence matters. First came the missile waves, then the visible impacts, and then the wider realization that this was not only a military episode. Once Tel Aviv was drawn directly into the strike pattern, the attack became a test of security credibility at the heart of Israel itself. What changed was not that Israel suddenly became defenseless, and not that every layer of its air defense failed. What changed was the perception of what those defenses can reliably guarantee under sustained pressure. The March 24th barrage showed that even a state built around readiness, warning systems, shelters, and one of the most advanced missile defense architectures in the world can still see missiles reach its urban core. That is a narrower claim than saying an entire strategic doctrine collapsed. But it is still a serious one, and it is the key to understanding why this moment resonated so strongly inside Israel. Subscribe if you want geopolitical analysis that explains not just what happened, but what it revealed. To understand why the reaction was so sharp, you have to understand what Tel Aviv represents in Israel's strategic imagination. It is not simply a large city. It is the country's economic center, a symbol of civilian continuity, and one of the spaces most closely associated with normal life under extraordinary regional pressure. When missiles reach that space, the effect goes well beyond the physical impact points. It tells the public that the protected interior is no longer fully separated from the logic of direct confrontation with Iran. That is where the shock comes from, not from surprise that war is dangerous, but from the realization that the distance between the battlefield and the national core has narrowed. That distinction matters, because Israel's security model has never relied only on military strength in the narrow sense. It also depends on the credibility of national protection, the sense that even under threat, the country can preserve continuity, coordination, and a functioning civilian center. Sirens, safe rooms, civil defense procedures, and layered interception systems are all part of that promise. They are designed not merely to stop incoming fire, but to preserve social resilience. When multiple missile waves produce reported impacts in Tel Aviv and central Israel, that promise is not erased, but it is visibly strained. The result is a strategic shock, because confidence is part of deterrence, too. That brings us to missile defense. Israel's system remains one of the most sophisticated in the world, but systems like Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow do not create invulnerability. They create layers of reduction, delay, and interception. Under repeated salvos, the real question is not whether interceptions occur. They do. The question is whether enough missiles still get through to impose visible costs, disrupt urban routine, and make the public feel that the shield has limits under concentrated pressure. On March 24th, that threshold was crossed in a way that mattered politically and psychologically as much as militarily. And that is where the deterrence issue becomes more important than the raw damage count. Deterrence is not only about the ability to destroy enemy assets. It is also about shaping the enemy's expectations and confidence. If Iran can show that, even after severe pressure, it can still launch multiple waves and still touch Tel Aviv or central Israel, then it is not proving dominance over Israel. But it is proving that it can complicate Israeli planning and raise the cost of escalation. Israel still retains major advantages in technology, air power intelligence, and strategic coordination. Yet an adversary does not need parity to alter the equation. It only needs the capacity to make the home front a recurring part of the war. Tell me in the comments, do you think the deeper effect of these strikes was military, psychological, or political? The later pattern reinforced that conclusion. What happened on March 24th did not stand alone as a one-night shock that could be dismissed as an anomaly. Subsequent reporting described additional Iranian missile pressure, including cases in which strikes were not fully intercepted and civilians were killed or injured. That continuity matters because one dramatic night can be explained away as an exceptional breach. Repeated pressure is harder to explain away. It suggests that the relevant issue is no longer a single failure or success, but the cumulative burden imposed on the defensive system and on the society relying on it. Once that becomes the story, endurance becomes central. Israel can absorb a strike. It can absorb more than one. But a conflict is judged differently when repeated. Missile waves begin testing not only interception capacity, but public confidence, business continuity, emergency response rhythms, and the assumption that the country's central urban zone can keep functioning with only limited disruption. This is why Tel Aviv matters so much in strategic terms. A strike there does not simply create damage. It puts pressure on the broader image of national steadiness. From Tehran's perspective, that is strategically useful even without decisive battlefield success. Iran does not need to prove that it can overwhelm Israeli defenses in every round. It needs to prove that those defenses can be strained, that Israeli civilians can be pushed into recurring disruption, and that Israeli decision-makers must now calculate retaliation against a more visible risk to the country's urban center. In that sense, the significance of missile waves reaching Tel Aviv is that they turn deterrence from an abstract theory into a lived condition of vulnerability. There was also a wider regional audience for this exchange. Iran was not speaking only to Israel, it was also signaling to Washington, to Gulf capitals, and to every government watching the balance of risk in the region. The message was that Iran retained escalation capacity even after taking major blows. That does not mean Tehran controls the escalation ladder. It does mean it can still widen the field of consequence. And once that becomes credible, the conflict stops looking like a contained military contest and starts looking like a regional stress test with broader strategic implications. If you're getting value from this breakdown, hit like, because stories like this are usually buried under noise instead of explained clearly. Those broader implications became harder to ignore as the crisis evolved. The concern was no longer limited to battlefield developments or air defense performance. The risk expanded into energy security, shipping, financial confidence, and the possibility that prolonged instability could push costs far beyond Israel and Iran. That is why the strike on Tel Aviv matters in a wider frame. It was one of the clearest signs that this conflict had moved beyond controlled signaling into something with the power to unsettle the regional system and force outside actors to think in terms of spillover, not just local exchange. Inside Israel, though, the significance remained very specific. The shock was not a theatrical reaction to dramatic headlines. It came from a more precise realization. If Tel Aviv can be reached through multiple waves of Iranian missiles, then the assumptions governing safety, distance, and normal civilian continuity have been weakened in a visible way. Not eliminated, not destroyed, but weakened enough to alter how the conflict is perceived. And perception in a conflict like this is not secondary. It shapes political pressure, strategic patience, and the willingness to accept future rounds of escalation. That is the deeper meaning of the March 24th attack. It did not prove total defensive failure, and it did not prove that Iran had established strategic superiority. What it did show is that Israel's defensive architecture, however formidable, operates under real limits when faced with sustained pressure, and that those limits become far more consequential when the strikes reach the country's central urban core. Once that happens, the war no longer feels compartmentalized. It feels closer, more direct, and more structurally dangerous. The reason this matters so much is that wars are not shaped only by destruction. They are also shaped by what each side learns about the other's thresholds, pain points, and endurance. March 24th gave both sides information. Iran learned that visible pressure on Tel Aviv carries strategic value even without a decisive breakthrough. Israel learned that reducing risk is not the same as removing it, and that future decisions will be judged against a public now more aware that the national center can be pulled directly into the conflict. That changes the atmosphere around every next move. So the lasting significance of this attack is not just that missiles hit Tel Aviv, It is that the strike changed the perception of what this war can reach and what Israeli defenses can fully guarantee under repeated pressure. That is why the event landed with such force inside Israel, not because it signaled collapse, but because it exposed a visible vulnerability where Israel most needs credibility, continuity, and confidence. Share this with someone who wants to understand why the hit on Tel Aviv mattered far beyond the impact sites themselves.